Good morning, everyone. I'm Matt Ewalt, Texas Tribune Senior Director of Events and Live Journalism. Welcome to those joining us in person and online for today's conversation, a look back at 2023 with the Texas Tribune, with Tribune CEO Sonal Shah and a panel of Tribune journalists, including higher education reporter Kate McGee, democracy reporter Rob Downen, politics editor Rebekah Allen, and photography fellow Eli Hartman. Today's event, for supporters and members of the Texas Tribune, offers an exclusive look inside the highlights of the news-filled year and what's to come in 2024. The incredible journalism discussed today and the impact of that journalism is possible because of your continued support. All of us at the Tribune are grateful to you, whether you're here in person or online, for making our journalism possible. Today's program will run an hour with 45 minutes for conversation and 15 minutes for your questions. Here in Austin, we have mics for our in-person audience, and our virtual audience can submit questions on our online portal, our Q&A portal at texastribune.org/ask. That's texastribune.org/ask. Our program will begin with some reflections from Sonal, and then we'll welcome our journalists to the stage. And with that, I turn the program over to Texas Tribune CEO Sonal Shah.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming in today. And it's a nice day outside, so at least it's not raining and it's not freezing. So all of that together, we're excited to be here with all of you. Thank you for being members of the Texas Tribune. As you know, this has been a super eventful year. There's been no shortage of stories to cover, from the Texas legislature to everything Emily is doing on abortion in the state, to the connections between white supremacists and lawmakers, to the Ken Paxton impeachment trial. And I don't know if many of you also saw the Uvalde documentary recently on PBS, but the continual work that's taking place on Uvalde is important, and the journalism that has been taking place there. It has been not just eventful, but as you know, and many of you know, we've had a tough year. Financially, we did have to do our first round of layoffs this year, and hopefully our last. But it's been a tough year financially from an economic perspective. And at the same time, this team has continued to deliver. They have delivered incredible journalism. We have reached more members this year than we have in the past. We are continuing to plug away, smaller team, but we are continuing to plug away, and we know that importance of journalism in this state is critical. As we go into the election year next year, it's even more important that good journalism continues to thrive and survive. One of the things that we have seen as a part of the work that we've been doing is papers across the state continue to republish the Texas Tribune's materials. Last year, it was over 500 papers across 500 times our stories were the front page stories of newspapers across our state. And we're seeing that continue. And this is important. It's sad on one way that we are the front story, and that means journalism in local communities is going away. At the same time, we are happy that they are continuing to use our journalism, but it's a good reminder of what's happening with journalism across the state and why it's so important that good journalism that is credible, reliable, and fact-based continues to get into the hands of communities, to our members, to others, to make sure they know what's happening in the state, holding our government accountable to the work that they need to do, as well as giving people information about what the impact of policies are in their lives and why it matters. So this is something that we take seriously, we think is really important, and I think next year we're geared up to do more. We have an incredible series that our journalists will be leading on democracy, on a democracy initiative, Small D Democracy. We want to know where people are in their communities. What does it mean to them? Not just about voter participation and whether you will vote or not, but what matters to you? What makes you participate in your community? What does civic engagement look like? We're going to start that series. That's going to be important. We're going to do some work on news avoidance, why people are avoiding news more, so we can understand what we can do differently and what we can also share with the rest of the country, or what the changes that are taking place. And then we're going to continue our incredible election coverage that we do with our journalists, and that will continue. And you will see a lot more of that, and you will be hearing from our team most recently. But we're optimistic about next year. We're optimistic because we know journalism matters, and we're going to keep fighting for it every single day. We're optimistic because we know that our work matters and that what we do makes a difference in daily lives. And I just want you to know, like, the journalism, I've worked in countries where journalism doesn't exist, and what has happened, I will say this is the light that needs to shine on a regular basis. Making sure that we are letting people know what is happening in their communities, giving people the information they need, and letting them make the decisions that they need is critical. And I hope you will join me and be just as excited about the future that is coming and what we are planning on doing. But today's conversation is really about just giving you insight into what has our team seen? What have they what choices did they make? How did they make them? Just to give you some insight as members, so you know that this is important for us, but give you a sense of what they're looking at and what they think the future will also bring. So with that, I'm going to ask Rebekah, Kate, Eli, and Robert to join us. I'm always afraid I'm going to trip here. So we are not in the order here, which I'm going to ask questions, but you have Rob here, Kate, Rebekah, and Eli. And I wanted to, Rebekah, start with you first, because this year was the 88th legislative session. There were a lot of stories that came about. How do you sum up, the months and then all these special sessions? Like, what is your takeaway this year?
So it was indeed a very exhausting year of legislating. It was a regular session, 4 special sessions, and then sandwiched in there was 2 weeks of a Senate trial for the impeachment of Ken Paxton. So just kind of a stunning marathon and a slog. My takeaways would probably be twofold. The first is that after all of that legislating, we don't have school vouchers passed. And that's a significant loss for Governor Greg Abbott, because more than a year ago, he was out there campaigning on the promise of passing school vouchers. He invested tremendous political capital. At the beginning of the legislative session, he said, "This is my priority." He, throughout the legislative sessions, he made really explicit threats to the lawmakers that they needed to pass school vouchers, and he called them back over and over again, so that we are in December and we don't have school vouchers. That's a really big legislative loss for him. The second, more broad takeaway, and Rob will have a lot to say about this, I'm sure, is about the emerging Republican civil war on multiple fronts. To be clear, Republicans control every lever of government. They control the House, the Senate, the executive branch, the judicial branch, and many of the fights, or all of the fights that were happening legislatively, were between Republicans. That was vouchers, which was kind of an outlier because you had some Republicans who were against it and voted to stop it. But on most of the issues, like immigration and property taxes, it was Republicans who were on the same side saying, yeah, we want a property tax cut, but we want it our way or no way at all. And that fighting was driven by a lot of personal grudges and animus that was really born from the Ken Paxton impeachment trial, and a lot of Rob's reporting on the Defend Texas Liberty leader who met with a really renowned anti-Semite and white supremacist.
So let's talk a little bit about the Ken Paxton impeachment trial. How did you all decide which way to take that and to approach covering the trial?
I think that moment was like, I think we felt like this is what the Tribune is for. Like this, we were conceived to rise to this occasion, and it was so historic, and it was so like perfectly in our lane. We committed to covering it exhaustively, 365 degrees. If you are a person who is obsessed with Capitol coverage and you wanted gavel to gavel coverage, like we wanted to be your resource for that, for the breaking news. If you are dipping in, we wanted to provide sort of the like 10,000 foot view of it. We wanted investigations into, the allegations against the Attorney General and Enterprise. We wanted explanatory journalism about the process. I mean, it was the Senate making up their own rules, so everything about it was like incredibly confusing. Like, who are the players? Who are the lawyers involved? Who are the people that are named in the impeachment complaints? I mean, we committed to being exhaustive about it, and you can't always in this industry commit to being everything to every person. But I think that for how special this moment was in Texas political history, it was incumbent on us to kind of try.
Kate, you had a big story this year. Well, you've had many stories this year, but one that certainly came from deep sourcing. How do you get these tips? How does that work? How do you sort of go through and decide to follow through on a specific tip?
Yeah, so we had a string of stories about Texas A&M and some instances of political interference in hiring there this year. The first one came from a source who approached us and said, this is what had happened to me, and they wanted us to tell their story, and they were willing to talk to us on the record and provide evidence. And in those situations, that comes from prior reporting and the trust that a source has in the Tribune and the ability for us to tell that story. And that was the story of Kathleen McElroy and the journalism professor at UT Austin, who had been hired at A&M with great fanfare, and then because of some conservative donors and regents who had raised issues with her past credentials and work at the New York Times, the school had essentially walked back that offer. And so we saw similarities to what had happened to Nicole Hannah-Jones a few years ago. And so we felt within the political climate of everything that had happened within higher ed this year, the elimination of diversity, equity, and inclusion offices. This felt like a huge example of kind of the political climate that was going on behind the scenes. And then subsequently, we published another story at A&M about a professor who had been put on leave because she had allegedly criticized the lieutenant governor in a lecture. That story, in terms of sourcing, was much different. And that story actually took us months and just happened to kind of publish around the same time as the McElroy debacle. And that was a tip that Rob actually got and passed along to me. And then my other colleague, James Barragan, and I worked on it because he had also gotten the tip. And that one was a months-long process. But again, it was the political climate, the fact that the lieutenant governor was involved and was, working his political power behind the scenes made that a very relevant story for us to pursue in this kind of climate within higher ed these days.
So the second story, it was a longer process. So give us just a bit of insight as to how does that process work? What happens when you get the tip, you start pursuing it, then what happens?
So we got the tip, and I had started working some sources on the higher education side because the tip was kind of vague. And sometimes, we get tips that are like, we heard this thing happened in this school, go check it out. And there's not a lot to work with. And so we were able to kind of confirm some more details and through sourcing connect the dots that, which we ultimately reported that the daughter of Land Commissioner Dawn Buckingham was the one who had complained about this professor. And then initially we just put in lots of open records requests, which is why it took so long to get back emails and documents from the university, from both universities, Texas A&M and the University of Texas Medical Branch, where the lecture actually happened. So part of it is like a waiting game to get the documents back, see what they show, and then going to sources and working them. While we were waiting for documents, I was scouring the internet looking for students who had been in that class, which took a really long time to find students, connect with them, convince them to talk to us about what that lecture was like. So we were also working, trying to find people who were in the room that day. And then ultimately, like getting all these open records requests back from multiple sources, the Lieutenant Governor's office, A&M, and being able to present what we had to the school to get some answers.
Yeah, so much more there. We'll come back to Rob. You also had a big tip this year about Nick Fuentes, and you sort of picked up on that tip. And tell us what you did, because I think it's pretty interesting, sort of how you approach this.
Yeah, I mean, we had gotten, I'd gotten word, I think, on a Tuesday or something, that Nick Fuentes, there was a chance that he was going to be at the offices of Pale Horse Strategies, which is consulting firm for far-right candidates. They're very connected to West Texas oil money and a lot of just very powerful and prominent people in the state. And I think I'd heard about this idea that Fuentes, who's an avowed Hitler admirer, one of the most famous white supremacists on the planet, arguably, was going to be at these offices either that Friday or the next. And Rebekah and I had a probably 2-second conversation that was like, if there's any chance that he's going to be there, we need to roll the dice. Our photo team was as supportive as well, so huge shout out to them. But yeah, so I basically 3 a.m. on the 6th, just got in my car and drove from Austin to Fort Worth and hung out in the parking lot for, I think, almost 10, 11 hours, something like that. And a photographer was also on another part of the parking lot. And at first we had seen Fuentes, who we thought was Fuentes, go in earlier around like 11 a.m. But because of the way that they walked in, we were unsure if we didn't have the photo. And 4 o'clock comes around, 5 o'clock comes around, parking lot is emptied except for like 2 cars. And I was literally texting Rebekah, and I was about to send the, I think that we made progress, but we didn't get what we came here for. Text, I'm gonna head home because there's no one here. It's a 3-day weekend. He probably left out the back, and lo and behold, right as I was about to send that text, he walked out. He just walked out. I'm presumably because they were waiting until there was gonna be less traffic coming out, and kind of that's how we got these photos that I think really just changed the state's political dynamic in a very real way. We're still very much seeing the impact of that as recently as last weekend. So,
and you not only got the photos, but you pursued the story for a period of time, and you continue to pursue the story. But tell us like what the process of that is.
I guess which
so when you first got the photos, you had to then figure out who they met with and what they did, and then sort of what was happening in the state capitol itself and with candidates. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for the longest time there has been a public acknowledgement of these groups, Defend Texas Liberty, Tim Dunn, and the Wilkes brothers, and how they've really exerted a lot of control over the state GOP and political apparatus. But I think that there hasn't been as much actual reporting on really who these groups are, how they're operating, whose playbooks they're borrowing out of. We talked about Paxton, some of the coverage we did in there, and I think actually probably the story that set me up for the Fuentes tip in the first place was I wrote this thing about how Defend Texas Liberty and its allies were recruiting Gen Z influencers with 250,000 people following them on Instagram to defend Ken Paxton, who's one of their biggest or closest allies. And I think just making the conscious decision earlier this year to really make that group kind of the focal point of my beat in many ways, and the way that they move, I think really just set us up in a way to get that tip in the first place. But since then, we've also really done a lot of work showing how, Nick Fuentes was not the only white supremacist in that orbit. There have been, we found, I think 5 or 6 who were either employed by or had recently appeared with groups funded by Defend Texas Liberty just in the month prior to the Fuentes meeting. And since then there's been there's been a lot of internal squabbling within Texas GOP about how or if to respond to these scandals, as recently as 2 weekends ago, where they declined to take up a ban on associating with Nazi sympathizers and Holocaust deniers. So it still remains, I think, I think that there's still much more fallout to come from that, especially going into the next year's primaries, where Defend Texas Liberty had really promised to be a major player, particularly going after those who voted for the Paxton impeachment or who were opposed to school vouchers. And I think that they kind of have a stink on them right now that's going to make them a little bit harder. So, and we've also seen that one of their auxiliary groups, Pale Horse Strategies, has already filed for a name change. So it appears that they're, not, I guess I shouldn't speculate, but they are certainly trying to, their strategy seems to be keep our heads down, push through this, and just pretend nothing happened. So
all the more reason journalism continues to follow, needs to continue to follow the story, but also the people behind that story. Eli, Rob talked a little bit about sort of, why having those photos really mattered, and photojournalism is such an incredible part of the work that we do here. Would love to hear from you a little bit of sort of how do you work with the reporters? How do you sort of think through the photos and what's important and how to sort of portray a story?
It typically kind of varies on a case-to-case basis. Like a lot of the time, we're not initially brought in at the earliest stage, which is kind of due to reporting of, hey, is this going to be an assignment that is going to be impactful visually, or is it just kind of going to be, more reliant on the words and reporting? But it kind of, when we go into it, we're thinking, what is going to be the most visually impactful? And with Rob, he kind of came to us immediately with, we just need photos of them there. And it ended up being a pretty simple thing, straightforward as it comes to like photojournalism, but in the long run is one of those assignments that ends up being the most impactful, of just showing what was there, what was going on in the most truthful manner. But as it comes to like other assignments, it kind of varies. Like I said, you can get brought in from the ground level where, the photo is a complete collaborative process of what are we trying to say visually, but what are we also reporting on? And can this assignment be something where visuals are more of a parallel rather than supplemental in that sense? So,
And I don't think that the Fuentes story would have been half as impactful if we hadn't had the photos there, because people have a lot of reservations about trusting media, and what we're asserting is explosive. So I think people had to see those photos, and I think Rob will even tell you, even with the photos, there were people who were trying to deny or say that it was
we set them up.
Yeah, so you have it was
they think
huge.
I'm so much smarter than I am.
Yeah, the photos were huge.
absolutely.
Eli, let's go a little bit deeper, and I agree with Rebekah. I mean, the photos really mattered, and it sort of really gave the story the reality check that otherwise it would have. I think people needed to see it. You did something in West Odessa also, which is just more sort of capturing with some of our regional reporters what's happening, and I think those the photos there really mattered in sort of telling the story. Tell us a little bit about that.
So that was one of those assignments where it was Carlos and I went out there with no clue who we were going to talk to. We had not found any sources beforehand. The only person he had before was the county judge in Odessa, Dustin Fawcett. And when Carlos and I went out there, it was an immediate, we don't really know what the story is going to be at this moment in time. We're out here trying to find sources, knocking on doors, and in West Odessa, that's a very tricky thing to do, sometimes dangerous. And it kind of just developed from there. And I remember there was a moment we visited one of the trailer parks out there, and one of the residents had allowed us in to photograph their home and their family. And that was like, Carlos and I were leaving, getting in the car, and we just looked at each other and we're like, this is a Tribune story. This is a moment where photos can tell a parallel story, but also be impactful enough to supplement Carlos's reporting. But it's also in that type of story, or at least specifically related to West Odessa, it was a lot of Texans don't know what an unincorporated community looks like in that sense, and especially one as drastic as West Odessa. So it was really important to try and tell the story, or try to show visually what a community like that looks like and how varied it is.
And you touch on something that's, I think it's important. It's like, you don't just get to take photos, right? You have to, it's permission. It's also thinking about what the community and how they would perceive it. Tell us a little bit about, like, just give us a little bit back end of, like, what's the process of when you decide to take photos, publish photos? Like, there's a process to this. It's not just you took a photo.
Yeah, absolutely. With West Odessa, the photo department kind of approached that story of, how do we paint this in the best light possible? Like, we don't want to misrepresent this community, because that's a huge part of photojournalism, is not trying to take advantage of the people that are allowing you essentially a slice of their lives, you know? And for me, photographing, going into a situation like that, especially with something as intimate as touring somebody's home, that's, you know, in some cases can be something that they could be embarrassed about, even though, you know, that they're making the most of their lives, and that's important. And so to me, I wanted to show the nuance of kind of, they take a lot of pride in what it is. And so you don't want to misrepresent that in a story. And it kind of goes into every moment of the process of, you know, asking to photograph to actually photographing, and then as it comes to editing the story and selecting which photos go into a build. But yeah.
Thank you. Rebekah, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of where we're going also, but let me particularly address one story that, you know, we've been following here in the Tribune, and that is sort of Kate Cox. But also just what the abortion ban means in Texas for women, especially. Tell us a little bit about. I mean, I know Eleanor's not up here, but I want you to plug her. But also tell us a little bit more about that story and what we're following, why it's important, and, you know, what it means for the state.
Yeah, well, this story is being expertly covered by our women's health reporter, Eleanor Klibnoff, who's in the room, and I'm sure would love to talk to you guys after this. It's just a monumental story. And as you guys probably have followed, you know, Kate Cox is a woman from Dallas whose fetus had a lethal abnormality. She was told that the fetus is likely to die. She wanted to get an abortion. She was granted a historic ruling from a Travis County judge who allowed her to have that abortion. That has since been stopped by the Texas Supreme Court. She's left the state. It's really just such an interesting case and a moment, like in women's health in Texas. But what I think is really interesting is Eleanor also detailed this story a month ago, what is time, when she wrote about an East Texas woman, Miranda Michelle, who was carrying twins who were conjoined. She was also told that those fetuses would die. I mean, it's just an incredible. I mean, it's an incredible moment. It's an incredible story. It's legislative. It's personal. You know, it's just a very sad state of what's happening right now.
Yeah, and I think importantly, and you know, Eleanor should speak more about this than I will ever, but I think the fact that you did the Miranda Michelle story also has had many women reach out to you for many other reasons. And I think, again, an important piece of, like, it's not just a policy that gets passed, but the implications on people's lives, and women's lives especially, and babies' lives, and what matters in that. And I think just another reason, just the importance of the coverage this year. So thank you for making that plug. But let me also pursue another question for you. What are you foreseeing next year with the elections coming up, and what is the team looking at?
Well, right now we're thinking about the primaries, and 2024 is going to be a huge year for elections. But in particular, you know, in Texas, a lot of these, because of gerrymandering, a lot of these races are sometimes, they come down to the primaries. So we're looking really critically for trends and for opportunities to explain to readers about sort of the impact of what these votes are going to look like. You know, it's not enough to just tell you, here's who's running for this seat. We want to show you, okay, here's six lawmakers who are running for re-election, they voted for vouchers. You have the pro-voucher lobby and Governor Greg Abbott who are going all in on their opponents. Meanwhile, you have another slate of lawmakers who voted against voted in favor of Ken Paxton's impeachment. Now you have Ken Paxton and all of his very hard right allies who are funding their opponents. What does it mean if this new slate of lawmakers are voted into the House? Well, for one, it means that you may have a House that is much more likely to pass vouchers. And two, if a bunch of candidates who are backed by Ken Paxton and Defend Texas Liberty are in the House, I mean, that signals that you're going to have a much more hard right, further, deeply conservative membership in the House, and the House is already very conservative.
Yeah, Robert.
I was just gonna say, yeah, I mean, I think that the next few months are gonna be really a litmus test of a few things. One being the lengths of voter memories. A year in politics these days is a very long time. But I also think that it's going to potentially give us a little bit more insight into particularly when it comes to the far right of the political spectrum in Texas. They have for years, and especially in the last year, really been threatening, a full-blown takeover of the legislature behind particularly driven by the Paxton impeachment and by school vouchers. And I think that it's going to be a very big test for that wing of the party to see just how, whether or not their threats about what the party wants actually match up with what primary voters want, at least. So.
Yeah, the primaries are gonna be, and Rebekah, your point about the primaries are gonna be where to watch, because this is gonna define the state in many ways. Rob, let me just continue with you. As you've been pursuing sort of Defend Liberty PAC, you've been pursuing these stories. What are you foreseeing next year that you're gonna continue to follow and that we should be paying attention to?
That's a good question. I think that there is and I haven't written about this yet, but I think that there's a much broader synthesizing of the far right in Texas with national politics. I think that we're going to see a lot, I think there was a story that came out last week that Tim Dunn is one of the major funders of Donald Trump's major super PAC. But I think that we're going to start seeing a lot more of the a lot more. At least maybe I shouldn't say we'll start to see, because maybe it's already existed. But one of the things I plan to really be focused on is the way that they are moving and influencing national politics ahead of the 2024 election, because I think that they do see in Trump a rare opportunity to really advance a lot of their policy objectives that probably would not come for I guess. Again, without speculating, I think that he's their best bet for a lot of the movement that they've been funding and pushing for 15, 20 years now. So
and give us a little bit more insight into what is that? What are the things that you foresee happening if that happens?
If Trump is, I think that I think that Trump has really emboldened a lot of the groups in that far right, specifically around immigration, stuff like that. And I think that what he has really done is, again, let me backtrack. These groups, one of their strategic goals for the last 15, 20 years is to just perpetually move the Overton window of the Republican Party further and further to the right. That's one of the reasons why they rarely are attacking Democrats. They are much more focused on attacking incumbent Republicans as insufficiently conservative, bankrolling primary challenges to those who break with them on a lot of very already conservative social issues. And so I think that Trump is a very useful tool in that project as well, because he is someone who really is not confined to a lot of the, I guess, political norms that for a long time I think were a hindrance to that kind of strategy. And so having him, back in the White House, I think would do a lot for their ability to push through really, really hardline stances on, everything from immigration to, I think that we're already seeing a huge infusion of or I guess erosions of church-state separation, those type of things. And I think that hit his presidency, and given what he has telegraphed he would do with his presidency as far as reshaping the federal bureaucracy in his image, for lack of a better term, I think is a very unique, once in a generation opportunity for that movement. So,
Thank you. Kate, you've been covering higher ed. What do you foresee next year happening in the higher ed landscape? And then how do you foresee the elections affecting any of that?
I think, in Texas, I think one thing that I will definitely be watching is, we have this ban on diversity, equity, and inclusion offices that was passed this year, but the law doesn't officially go into effect until January. So even though schools have been kind of ramping down those offices and preparing, I think I'll be watching what the impact actually looks like in practice. And, we see this trend of state lawmakers, far-right groups, kind of cherry picking different things that they see happening on campus that they point to as examples of liberal indoctrination or diversity efforts that they think might, be illegal once this law is in place, and how schools and the legislature are going to react to that and respond. So I think that is one thing I'll be focusing on. We saw, when Trump was president, he really escalated the attacks on higher education in his term. And so I think higher ed has been squarely in the political crosshairs for years, and that has only continued. And I think it's one of those things that remains to be seen of what else in the culture wars could come up. Before, it's funny to think now, but diverse DEI and diversity, equity, and inclusion was not even a conversation topic before January of this year. It, the Manhattan Institute wrote a piece of draft legislation for lawmakers to use to ban these offices in their states. Texas was successful, as well as Florida. And so, it kind of remains to be seen what will happen and what other kinds of ways higher ed can be pulled into those conversations during the elections. I also think that with the higher ed has been put in the spotlight in the recent months with the Israel-Hamas war. On both sides of the aisle, people are critical of how higher ed has responded to that and how they're handling free speech on campus. And I think those conversations are going to continue, especially in relation to the elections. So I think there's lots of tension that could kind of build up to be watching throughout the next year.
Yeah, and it's been interesting to see sort of legislators taking up all of what's happening on campuses. And there were several bills, if I'm not wrong, in this past legislature that were affecting higher ed, right?
In this past year?
The ADA
Yes.
legislature.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about a couple of them?
There was the DEI ban that is going to affect in January. There was a bill to originally, it was drafted to eliminate faculty tenure. That was a pet project of the lieutenant governor who, threatened to eliminate tenure after he got mad at some UT professors for declaring support for the teaching of critical race theory in higher ed. Ultimately, tenure was not eliminated, but it's now in statute how tenure should get awarded and revoked. Which still has some faculty members concerned about how that can be used in the future, in individual cases. So it was not seen as a win, but definitely better than eliminating it for many faculty. So those were kind of the major political.
Is that having an impact in attracting faculty to Texas?
Yes, anecdotally I hear, and they were even saying this during the legislative session, that the threat of eliminating tenure had caused faculty members from across the country who were interested in taking a job at a university in Texas to take pause and wait it out and kind of see what had happened on that front. I think the main question for many of them was, why would I take a job where I'm not given the job security I can get at a school in any other state in the country? And we've continued to see that. There are, many deans or people who are in those hiring committees who are having trouble finding qualified candidates, and people who are wanting to uproot their lives because I think there is a concern that in the next legislative session, is tenure going to still come back on the table to possibly be eliminated, even though it's now in statute? That doesn't mean that the conversation's over.
Yeah. Eli, you are a fellow Tell us a little bit about what your experience has been, and then I'd also love to talk to you a little bit more about sort of things that you think what are types of things that we are pursuing that we should be paying attention to. But tell us about your experience first.
So I am currently like one of the last Poynter Fellows. They just closed the fellowship this year, I think a couple months or a month ago. But with a long-term position like that, coming into the Tribune feels less like a fellowship and more you're really integrated into the newsroom. And I think that's fair to say for any fellowship here. I feel like we go to any length to kind of really integrate the fellows, keep them involved in stories, and kind of encourage them to go further. But for me specifically, it's just been kind of a shift in direction in a sense. I came from a daily newsroom, so it was day in, day out of taking photos, and shifting here, it's been more of photo editing and assignments, kind of thinking more long-term with enterprise projects and things like that. And to me, it's been really insightful in kind of seeing the direction that's going, but it's also working in a newsroom such as the Tribune. It's kind of eye-opening to the different processes that take part every day.
So aside from like the big stories, tell us a little bit about the back end of like how do you all pursue photojournalism? Like what does that look like?
Do you mean like?
How do you work with the reporters thinking through, at the front end? How do you think through where you were going to go? What does that look like?
I mean, initially, when reporters and editors come to us with stories, there's a basic budget line of this is what we're doing, this is what we're thinking about, and from that moment on, it's really collaborative. I think here, we really strive to get involved with the reporter of, hey, what's going on? What do you think is working best? A lot of the time, we like to rely upon the question of, what is the schedules going on? What's going to be the most visually interesting aspect? And from there, it's kind of the Tribune relies a lot on freelance work related to photojournalism, which I think is one of its strong suits. And from there, it's kind of informing either the photographer on staff or the freelancer of this is kind of the vision we're going, but it's also really respectful of kind of our own unique vision in that, what we are thinking it can look like. And then from there, it's just kind of a little bit of artistic direction in some senses, but yeah.
I want to be in the background of seeing the artistic direction because it's incredible the stories that you all tell. So thank you for that. And Rebekah, what did you leave on the cutting room floor this year? What did you not decide to pursue in some of the stories, from this session and all that happened this year?
I would like to say that we got the important things, hopefully. I think that in any legislative session, there's a ton that goes unreported, unfortunately, especially as like newsrooms across the state are cutting back and sending less people to state capitals. We really try to be, during the legislative session, we really kick it into high gear, and like the whole newsroom turns into like a state legislative bureau. We like to say that we have the largest state house like in the country, or bureau. But that being said, we gave a lot of attention to things like property taxes, the border. Ken Paxton's impeachment took up a lot of oxygen. The expulsion of Brian Slayton took up a lot of oxygen. They file thousands of bills a year, so that means that there's a lot of things that like we frankly didn't get to, and it's a reason to continue to invest in local journalism and in the Texas Tribune so that we can try to cover as much as we can.
Go ahead, Rob.
I was just gonna say, yeah. I think just looking back over the legislative session, I think it was also a testament to just what can happen when you are dealing with a legislative body where it is a very far to one side of the political spectrum. I'm thinking of two bills in particular where, like, when they first came up, we basically didn't even really think that they were going to be things, because whether from what we were hearing about them or just on their face, they seemed like something that wouldn't pass, whether it was banning citizens of China from owning land or allowing unlicensed chaplains to go into schools. I mean, those were two bills that, like, I think ended up being pretty significant storylines in the legislature, but when, in our early planning meetings, I don't even think really got much of a nod, because I think there were a lot of people who were surprised that they actually did get the traction that they did. So it just, again, to borrow off what you were both saying, I think is a testament to how important it is to invest in local news so that there can be more eyes on all parts of the legislative process, because there's, again, just too much going on for us to cover everything with the scrutiny that we probably should. So
I would love to start with some questions. So if any of you have questions, there's a mic right here. And I know if there's any questions online, Matt, you'll let us know. Ooh.
So the state of Texas has semi-open primaries. Are you going to be looking at any crossover voting?
Rebekah, do you want to take that one?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. We have semi-open primaries. You've talked a lot about the reaction to Ken Paxton, the reaction to the abortion issue, the money that is being spent by the far right on the primary. The question is whether you will be looking at crossover voting of Democrats voting in Republican primaries to protect certain legislators.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think we're always looking for trends and consequences to what they're doing. I mean, I think you'll see, certainly you see some of that every year. I think we'll be looking for, trying to understand the reasons that people are voting for, the motivations that are driving voters for a lot of different issues.
I think I've seen just at least some chatter just peripherally within some Texas GOP circles about that being a major thing going into this year too. So they're certainly cognizant of it, and I imagine we will be as well. So
Thank you.
Thank you very much for holding this forum, and I've learned a lot, and I continue to learn and appreciate the Tribune. And I really appreciate the nonpartisan approach, and that makes you stronger. And let me say, I'm just laying a little groundwork here, because I'm going to ask a partisan question, and it doesn't reflect my personal feelings. Because, we all were Democrats back in the 70s and 80s, and then we became kind of independent, and now the state is Republican. I'll just consider myself down the middle. We talk about issues. But one thing I noticed, I really appreciated when I was working around the Capitol back in the 70s and 80s, more the 80s, that there was a balance. And you didn't know who was going to win the statewide race, and you didn't know who was going to come out ahead on that bill. That's not true anymore, as we know. I guess what I've noticed, because I work outside each House and the Senate, is where is the Democratic Party to help bring balance back into the process? There's so much fodder that comes when they put a bill on the floor that representatives of the party could set up a little table over there with a camera and get free press statewide on every day. And I'm thinking, it's kind of silent around here, but it sure would be fun for the people in West Texas to know how they're being affected. And now you see some things that do affect them, vouchers, for example, and it's not a partisan issue. So I guess one of the things I'd like for you to begin to turn the heat up on the party to at least give a balance, and then let the people decide at that very, very last minute when the election comes, do we vote Republican or Democrat? So I just see this state is going to continue to be the way it is until the party itself reforms itself, decides to speak out. I mean, I ran for office once, the editor of the Round Rock Express became a good friend and said, "Now, Randy, the best thing you can do is to get free press. Put out press releases, make it newsworthy, and you don't have to pay for it." I say that to the Democratic Party. Just a thought.
I'm not going to ask you to go down the partisan route, but I am going to say, Rebekah, I'd love for you to take a crack at sort of what is happening with the Democratic Party.
I think that the Democratic Party in Texas is definitely injured and probably in a rebuilding phase. I mean, I think I moved to Texas in 2018, so right as we were having the Beto O'Rourke moment, and I think obviously there was so much excitement, and there were a lot of gains for Democrats that year, and I think that in 2020, Democrats underperformed. They in 2022 they underperformed again. So I think that there is sort of a there's probably some party introspection that's happening. And then I will say that when you have, it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy because you need money to win elections, right? I mean, and Republicans in Texas have a ton of it. And a lot of that money is from out-of-state investments. So sometimes when Democrats nationally are deciding like where to invest in certain races, if they feel like there's a lack of enthusiasm in Texas, then maybe they're putting their money elsewhere, and then you have to give them a reason to invest. So it is it's a balancing act.
Rob, did you want to? You're good. Okay.
Thank you all. This is Cassie with the Tribune. I'm asking some questions on behalf of the members who are joining us online today. So thank you all. Steve asks, failure to pass vouchers is, of course, a big story, but isn't a bigger story the legislature's failure to pass school funding at all? What is the prospect?
Absolutely. I mean, that is kind of a stunning political story in itself. Both that Governor Abbott took the risk of saying you can't have one without the other. I mean, now we are going to see if voters are going to accept that. I mean, there is a world where the legislature could have passed, raises or bonuses as the final form, like when in the final bill was, and increases in the school allotment. We have neither because they were tied to vouchers. So we'll see if there's political consequences. That's a story I think about. Like, will teachers organize themselves? That's a pretty big voting block in Texas.
Yeah, I think you also there was a story about potentially schools closing if there's not enough funding.
Absolutely.
And that's gonna have an impact on students.
I'm going to shift gears a little bit. We've just had an election where there were 12 issues, I think, on state amendments to our Constitution. Can somebody explain why any one or all of those lifted to the elevation of being amendments to the Constitution?
I think the question is why were they amendments? Like, why wasn't it just legislative process? What caused it to be an amendment?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, this is something I need Karen for. It's technical, but it's like they're constitutional amendments because constitutionally to allocate that level of money, like you have to go to voters to allow them to do that. That's the really poor answer. But yeah, that's.
Is there a threshold on money?
Yes, it has to do with a budget threshold, but it was not arbitrary. I think that lawmakers would have loved to have just made the call to, cut property taxes on their own.
I think we should put all 2,000 bills each session to the voters.
it's a different way.
What you wish for there.
Cassie, I know you have another question.
I do. This one is from Gene, who is actually watching from Santa Fe. So thanks, Gene, for tuning in from New Mexico. He asks, a basic question that I have not seen any one news outlet address is, will the continuing move to the right by Texas office holders ultimately have a negative impact on the Texas economy? Perhaps, Sonal, this is a question for you.
Well, I'm going to ask Rob to start, and then we'll go ahead, Rob.
Oh, you called me with the economy, so I'm
Yeah,
deferring
no,
to you.
you don't have to talk
I heard
about
the word
economy,
I
just-
was like, no, thank you.
I think the broader question, and this is a question of it will, and it comes with abortion, it comes with everything else. Are young people choosing not to move to Texas? Will it have an impact on, let's say, even OBGYNs wanting to take residency in Texas? Will we see professors, and Kate, I asked you this question, will you see professors not wanting to come to Texas? All of this is, somewhat economic, but it is implications for much more in terms of what will happen if the continued, far-rightiness of the Republican Party. What will that create for the economy here? And let me ask each of you a very specific question on this. Kate, go a little bit deeper in what else you're seeing in higher education and whether you could see implications of students not wanting to come to study at UT or the public schools here, not the private schools, but the public schools here. And Rebekah and Rob, I'll come back to both of you in a second.
I mean, I think when you have schools like UT or A&M, and we have so much just growth here in the state, I don't think we're going to see those schools see major declines or like exoduses. I mean, this UT Austin is a very well-renowned school. People want to get into it. It's a hard school to get into. We have lots of Texans who, are clamoring for those spots already. And we have, just growth of high schoolers in K through 12. I do think, that one of these, talking about the amendments that were on the election this year, one of the topics or other things that the legislature did was put, $3.5 billion into these new endowments for the non-UT and A&M for, University of Houston and Texas Tech, UNT and Texas State, to help them build up their research portfolios, to be able to kind of rise in these national rankings, to attract more students and faculty from around the country. And there was a big talk about the tension in that of, all right, you're throwing all this money towards these schools to help elevate them nationally, but you're also threatening to eliminate tenure and creating situations on campus where diverse students from all backgrounds, might not feel welcome or want to, or feel supported or be able to succeed in those schools. How do you kind of, string those two together? And so I think that there is concern that even as they're putting all this money into these programs in these schools to build that research, who's going to come work here to enhance, to take that money and enhance the quality of the schools. So I think that is kind of the tension that we'll see kind of unfold as these schools get this new influx of funding that the voters have approved this fall.
Do you feel like there's a propensity for a brain drain of people saying, yeah, I'm going to go to UT Austin, but then I'm getting out of Texas and I'm taking all the money that Texas put into me and taking it elsewhere?
I think that could be a possibility, especially, left-leaning students who, might come to a UT and say, I'm ready to go elsewhere. And also depending on how the economy is here in terms of jobs in a place like Austin, the tech sector, and what opportunities you can have here versus elsewhere. Definitely.
I do have a thought on this, though. I think it's really interesting, though, that you have seen kind of a pendulum swing on this issue. If you go back and think about, I guess it was maybe 2017 or so when the bathroom bill was in the legislature, targeting transgender kids, and it was businesses that were really leading the fight, and Republicans were following businesses and saying, okay, we don't want to lose, the championship game, or things like that. And now we have seen a real sort of emboldening of Republican leaders who are telling business leaders to stand down. And I think Ron DeSantis and Disney is a really good example of this. So I think that the economic impact that we may see from this is probably what you're identifying as will people move here? But it has been very just interesting to watch this. I mean, and businesses, I think, are kind of getting in line, frankly. It's just not a fight that they want to have. They don't want to be in the news for, cancel culture. So I think we do see business leaders less likely to speak out anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that, one of the things that's really changed, not that it didn't exist during the bathroom bill and those discussions, but we have now seen a real mobilization of online harassment, online, targeted online campaigns, stuff like that, that I think really has, we saw it with Bud Light, we see it, it's a controversy of the day almost, it seems like at this point, of people targeting specific businesses for things that would have been totally non-newsworthy and mundane, 8 years ago. I mean, I do think that does kind of just speak to, or I guess, does kind of change the calculation of whether or not businesses are willing to speak up on, potential concerns about losing money or feeling ramifications because of, policies.
I'd like to also say thank you to y'all for doing this. I really appreciate what the Texas Tribune does. I've read some about Hispanic voters moving right in Texas, and I'm curious about what your thoughts are about that.
I think it's an interesting phenomenon. I think that Democrats in Texas were remain very hopeful that the changing demographics and the increasing increased number of Hispanic voters will lean in their favor. But we saw in the last election cycle a lot of especially border Democrats switch their allegiances. And I think that what it speaks to is that the issues around immigration and the border are complicated, and they are not black and white, and it is not a right-left issue. And I think that that's something that Democrats need to get their arms around. I think that's something the media needs to get their arms around. It is so complicated, and it's a reminder that no demographic is monolithic, but it is an incredibly interesting trend.
Well, I want to thank all of you for coming today. I want to thank Eli, Rebekah, Kate, and Rob. And a reminder again that journalism, while our journalism is free, creating journalism is not free. And as you hear from my colleagues, the amount of work that goes into any one story is a lot of work. They follow leads, they follow stories. We want to make sure we get the facts right. We don't want to just report a story with, it takes time, it takes effort to do that. And so as you think about the end of the year, please do continue to keep the Texas Tribune as one of your gifts for us. And please keep journalism and local journalism alive. It's the Tribune, but I would say across the state, the fact that newspapers are closing down across the state is a challenge for all of us. And making sure that these stories are told is very critical. So really appreciate all of you being members. Thank you for being a part of our community. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to more next year, and there'll be more to come. So thank you very much.